Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sharon Bonney. I'm the Executive Director for the Coalition on Adult Basic Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today on January 11th to the Research-Based Recommendations for Digital Learning in Adult Basic Education webinar. I'd like to take just a couple minutes to talk about a few things here as we get kicked off. Everybody here on this webinar will receive a certificate for CEUs. This will come within 24 hours. If you have any questions or do not receive that for some reason, you can contact support@coaid.org, but it is automatically put in our system that you would receive this within 24 hours of this webinar. Also, you can download this and other resources from other webinars on our Adult Educators repository. The link's right there. I'll also put it in the chat box. This has been a wonderful benefit to members, and a lot of members really value this. So you can go and upload to the Adult Educator Resource Repository and also download as well. I also would like to take just a minute to talk about our Educate and Elevate National Public Awareness campaign. We've had 49,000 plus legislative contacts since we launched this at our national conference back in April. And if you go to educateandelevate.org, you will be able to see that there's a number of tools there, but there's also a really easy to use link where you can contact all the legislators in your state with one quick email. So I'd like to encourage everybody that's here on this webinar, go to educateandelevate.org and help us out, help us ensure that there's funding for adult education. Next, I'd like to remind you that our national conference is coming March 25th through 28th at the Sheraton Phoenix Hotel. We expect about 2,000 attendees from around the country, all sharing best practices, and it's a great networking opportunity. There should be over 30 strands to choose from, including our first ever adult learner strand. And now I'd like to introduce you to the stars of the show. We have Dan Griffith with us. He'll be taking notes and answering questions, and the founder of Essential Education, Michael Ormsby. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Michael Ormsby.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Let me get my screen shared. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes, we can. It looks great, Michael.
Okay. All right. Thanks for attending. Please introduce yourself in the chat box if you'd like. Okay, so you know who we are. For those of you that have not heard of Essential Education, the company was founded in 2004 with the purpose of improving the way adults are being educated in basic skills. Our main focus is on finding ways to increase student completion rates. Our specialty is digital learning technology, although we do publish print material as well. So, up front, that means we have a bias when it comes to digital learning technology. We have seen it work firsthand. We're believers. So we were really excited to see the results of the Joyce study because it's confirmed things that we've seen for many years. So what we're going to do today is look at the findings from a 3-year study funded by the Joyce Foundation. These findings were released in June, and I've included a link in the chat so you can actually look at the report on the findings. And I've got other information in there as well. Okay, so the purpose of this study was to see if digital learning technology could improve the learning outcomes in ABE literacy and numeracy programs. So it looked at 5 different types of learning software in 14 programs across the US over a 3-year period. And so what we're going to do today is dig deeply into not only the types of digital learning technology that produce the best results, but how students reacted to it. And then we'll look at the classroom practices that integrated the learning technology into or with the direct instruction that the teacher was doing. So our focus isn't just on the findings of the study, but really what you can do with it. And that's our goal today, to not just give you information that's interesting about the study, but really ideas and tools and action plans that can make a difference in what you do. I'd like to make this more of a dialogue than a lecture, but it's kind of hard to do with a webinar the way it's set up. But please feel free to ask questions and make comments. Dan's here to help me with that, and I'll stop my presentation every so often to answer those questions. And I've also left plenty of time at the end for that. Okay, before we get into the study, I'd like to tell you a story about distance learning. Essential education started, as I said, in adult education about 13 years ago. And the first thing we started with was a distance learning course for GED prep. It wasn't sold through adult schools, but sold directly to students. The first version of this was like what you see in much of the adult ed software today. It was built on a series of text-based slides, kind of like a PowerPoint. And the program, we also included student practice tests that were aligned with the GED, and those predicted readiness for the actual GED test. Interaction for the student involved answering questions and clicking on the next button. Okay, so our assumption was that the student would be sufficiently motivated by their assessment scores on the practice test and their need to get a GED credential to self-direct their learning. Our second assumption was that they were strong enough readers to process a text-based delivery system of the content. So what happened? I bet you can guess what happened, those of you who've been doing this for a while. The students started out really strong, but they didn't stay with it. After a while, we even included a free one-on-one tutoring service, but that didn't even help. So what went wrong? Was it the type of software we used, or was there even a deeper problem about how adults learn with digital learning technology? Now, some people might say this is what you'd expect with ABE students, because learning software is just not well suited for low literacy students. Others might even go further to suggest that digital learning software can't really teach. It should only be used as practice activities. I want to digress a little bit from my story, because how adults use digital learning technology was really the core question that the Joyce study attempted to answer. So let's think about it a little bit. What do we know about how adults learn? I think there are at least 6 things we know, and there are more, and feel free to add to the list. First of all, adult ed students often are not independent learners. So just handing them a workbook and expecting them to figure out what they should be learning often does not produce the expected results. They need some guidance, some hand-holding. Not all students, but some do for sure. Second thing is, many of our adult ed students have gaps in their conceptual knowledge. While they've most likely been exposed to what we're teaching, they're sometimes missing pieces in their understanding. And these need to be addressed before they can move on to more complex things. Another thing we know is that students, adult learners, learn at different speeds. And this, of course, is one of the core challenges with direct instruction. Some students just have to repeat the instruction several times before they're going to get it, which is why, of course, digital learning technology is so helpful, allows them to do that. A fourth thing is often adults are not strong readers. Adult learners are not strong readers. The average reading level for adult ed students entering into adult ed programs is 5th grade. Another element is that, or challenge is that, education has often not been a very positive experience with them. They can kind of see themselves as educational failures. And the last thing is that some students just lack the tech skills to work with online programs. And of course, there are teachers who do as well. And then, of course, access to computers is often an issue. And this is why mobile solutions are so important. I think we can agree, I hope that we can agree that these are core problems that we encounter with adult learners. Okay, so back to the story. what we needed to do was figure out what kind of software could overcome these issues. It became clear as we thought about it that we needed to find a way to give students a very different kind of learning experience than previously. One that engaged them emotionally and cognitively and gave them continual feedback and support. And also one that was able to create a customized learning plan for each learner, okay? So in 2008, we launched a new version that had two big differences. One thing we added was what's called an adaptive learning system that used a set of built-in assessments to figure out what each student needed to learn, and then mapped out the optimal path, the learning path for that student. And I'm not going to go into the details about how adaptive learning works now, because that is one of the core recommendations from the Joyce study, and we'll get into it later. The second change we made was instead of relying on text to teach, we used really strong audio and video elements that engage the student at a deeper level. This is called simulation learning software. It's a learning technology that puts a student into real situations where they can actually apply what they're learning. So we use a cast of characters that are talking to each other about the things that they're trying to learn. Okay, so how did we do? What happened? Well, PassGED.com, the direct-to-student program, has grown to be the largest online adult ed program in the country. There are currently 173,000 students that are enrolled in this. And most important, what we see, because we can look at the data from our students, they stay with it. And they're getting their HSE credentials and going on to career programs. Okay, so what's the point of the story? What I'm not trying to do is sell you something, but rather give you a firsthand experience about how different types of learning software can have very different learning outcomes. And this, of course, as I said, is the point of the Joyce study. It was designed to figure out that very thing. To my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the largest, most far-reaching study done in adult education about digital learning. Okay, so what are our goals today? What are we going to do? First, we're going to look at how the study was designed. Then we're going to use the findings from the study, and we'll look at classroom practices as well as the digital learning features that were responsible for the gains in learning outcomes. And then from that examination, we're going to create a list of things you can do to see better learning outcomes in your programs. Again, I'm trying to make this very practical. I want to say also, our company did have a product in the study. It was called GED Academy. But again, the study or this session isn't about our products. Our goal is to inform you about the findings of the study. Okay, any questions? Dan, anything I need to talk about before we go into the next part?
Just a couple things, Michael. If you want to just maybe at the end of the webinar, if you'll also put the link to the study and the resources in the chat box, that will let people know that they'll get it. We'll be able to copy it at the end. I think we put it in the very beginning, but let's also add it at the end.
Oh, okay.
And then a good question was asked about.
Remind me to do that, okay?
I will. Yeah. And then a great question was asked about when you shifted to the more audio and visual format, did it affect students' abilities in terms of, practice on reading and working with literacy? Because, you were making such a shift away from just the textual based.
Yeah. Okay, that's really a good question. And I go into that later, but I'll make that point now. What the difference was not to use the student's reading ability or level as the only method for them to learn. That didn't mean or doesn't mean that we didn't teach reading skills. We have a whole course on reading, which uses text of course, to teach them how to read and to read critically. So it was that what we saw was that if we didn't make their reading level or their ability to comprehend well, their learning depended on that. They stayed with it. They got more involved in it. Then we could go and actually teach the reading skills at their own, according to what they needed or could handle. I don't know if that's making sense. Okay, all right. So, okay, where are we now? All right, let's look at our next thing. Okay, let's talk about what the study actually was designed to find out. There are 4 basic things. First, it looked at how teachers are currently using digital learning in instructional practices and how those practices affected learning outcomes. We're going to look at 2 predominant models, blended and hybrid, which cover most of the use of learning technology in adult ed. Okay? The next thing it was designed to find out is what program practices and software design features are associated with more intense use of online technologies. Basically, how to get students to use it more, both teachers and students. The third thing was, can the use of well-designed and well-implemented online learning technologies result in gains in literacy and numeracy? Basically, does it work? And fifth was, which program conditions and practices and online technology features, learning technology features, produce the best learning gains and outcomes? What did these classrooms look like? What elements and features of the software increased learning outcomes? Again, remember, it used 5 different types of software in 14 different programs. Okay? All right, so let's get in and actually look at the results. A company or group called Digital Promise created this really cool infographic which summarizes the findings. Again, this is in the resources, which we'll put at the end. Okay, so let's zoom into this a little bit, because it's hard to see all at once. All right, so one of the key findings was that products that were more fully integrated into regular instruction were used more and had better results. Okay, so what does fully integrated into instruction actually mean? The study identified several models that are used in adult ed for implementing digital learning. Those 2 models are, as I said before, blended and hybrid learning. And they cover, these 2 models plus distance learning cover the majority of situations in which digital learning is used in adult ed. Okay, so how do they define blended learning, the blended learning model? Well, the blended model learning requires, first, a tight integration of an online curriculum and or resources into a broader instructional curriculum. Okay. Second, this means that the online content is connected to what the teacher is teaching and that the instructors link class content to the content the students are using apart from the direct instruction, what they're doing online. And to use this model, instructors, of course, have to monitor or look at student progress online and use that data to identify learning needs and adjust in-class instruction. So basically what this is saying is there's this constant blending of both direct instruction and digital instruction based on defining what that optimal learning path is for the class as a whole, but each student in particular. Okay? The hybrid model, while it uses both classroom instruction and digital learning tools, the two are not closely integrated. What the teacher is teaching is not informing what the student is learning online and vice versa. Obviously, both the curricula are similar because they're both aligned to a particular assessment or the CCR standards. So it's not that the learner is getting two different learning paths, but that the teacher doesn't use the data created by the online programs to inform their teaching, nor do they use what they're teaching to direct the student learning online paths. So the difference between the models, I think you get it, is the degree of integration with the digital tools. Basically, the hybrid model has very little integration with the learning software, while the blended learning has lots. Okay, the blended or the hybrid model is probably used more in adult ed. Okay. Now, as we said earlier, the study indicated that digital learning software that was more fully integrated into regular instruction was used more and had greater positive results. So this brings up the question of how to integrate software into the classroom instruction. So I want to spend some time with this because it seems to be really the pivot point here. It's clear that you get better results if these two things are blended, but that's a lot of work, and it's hard to imagine how to do that. So I'd like to kind of get into this, and some of the questions are, what features need to be in the software to facilitate instruction? Another question is, are there teaching practices that facilitate more integration, and if so, what are they? And a third question to answer is, what burdens does integrating the digital learning technology with the classroom instructor put on the teacher? So let's go into these issues a little bit because it seems to me that they're really integral to improving the learning outcomes for our students. Again, any questions, Dan? I want to stop.
One question was about describing the population in the study with regards to percent of English language learners, but I think we're going to link people directly to the table study, right? So they'll be able to go in and find all those details?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll get that.
Yep. So the resource doc that I have actually has a report done by SRI, and then it also has the actual questions that were asked of the teachers in the surveys. So you can get all that information in the report.
Great. Okay, and we'll link that at the end again for everybody to have access to. So I think that's it.
Okay. So the study made very definite recommendations about these questions that we've talked about. So let's get into those. First, the study suggested that learning experiences should be individualized and self-paced. Okay? Self-pacing is common to almost any online experience, any software, but individualizing or personalizing the learning is not. And I want to go into that because I think this is really an important thing. I think it's obvious why individualizing learning is so important in an adult ed classroom. I mean, the students have gaps in their knowledge, and so each of them is kind of, have different gaps, has different things they need to know. As we said, that they're learning at different speeds. They're kind of all over the place on what they know and need to know. They also have different attitudes about learning and different abilities, as well as their goals are different. So the question is, how could we possibly personalize the learning for each student? Okay, so we talked about this before. I want to go into it a little bit more. This need for differentiating learning has given birth to a new type of learning technology called adaptive learning. It's used very greatly in K-12, not so much in adult ed. Okay, so adaptive learning, to read the slide, is a computer-based educational system that modifies the presentation of material in response to student performance. It maps a unique learning path for each student based on their performance of target competencies. So it does what it says. It adapts to what the learner has mastered and not mastered, and maps out that optimal learning path for each student. And even better, a good adaptive learning program can identify those gaps in the learner's background and then focus first, I'm building those foundations before going on to more complex material. Now, I don't know what you think about this. Can kind of sound like magic. I mean, how can a learning program know what a student already knows, and needs to learn? So let's go into this and kind of look under the hood. We're exposed to adaptive software all the time. For example, Amazon adapts every time you search for something on Amazon or when you buy something. But it only has a few attributes to consider. If you're buying a book, it will tag the book and might show you similar books by that author or in that genre. But that's about it. It doesn't have very many attributes to connect to or to adapt the data to. An adaptive learning engine, though, needs to have thousands of data points if it's going to accurately plot the best learning path for the student. So how does it do this? So for it to work, it needs to have a kind of currency of exchange. By this, I mean there needs to be measures of actual learning acquisition by the learner that's meaningful to the teacher and the student as well. I'm not sure this is making sense. Let me go into it a little bit more. Adult ed programs are designed to teach a set of skills. These are usually defined by the assessment targets on high-stakes tests like HiSET or GED, or obtaining a specific score on an assessment like TABE or CASAS or Accuplacer. So an effective adaptive learning program starts with, excuse me, I hit the wrong button here. Starts with a database of all the skills the student needs to master. Then it looks at the outcomes of a series of learning events to determine the degree of mastery of each of these skills. Learning events are things that the student does, like to demonstrate mastery, like the activities in a lesson, or standardized practice tests or quizzes. For example, in a course for HiSET or GED test prep, there are literally thousands of skills, several thousands of skills to be mastered, and tens of thousands of data points that are used to determine mastery of these skills. So it's using a tremendous amount of data. So for the student, it feels like being educated with a personal tutor. The program is paying attention to the signals the student is giving, like a teacher would. What skills have demonstrated mastery and those that they have not yet mastered. And then it reacts and adapts the learning path, what the student will do next and learn next to make sure the student is successful. Okay, so that's how the technology works. Kind of complicated, I know. Maybe the question you're asking is, okay, how does this fit into my teaching? Into what is actually happening in my classroom? What I mean is, here is this amazing learning technology, but how can it actually integrate into the way you teach and the way your students are accustomed to learning? Well, let's go into that a little bit. So adult ed is built on traditional teaching practices. Students come to classes, they listen to lectures, they get one-on-one help, they do practice activities in a workbook, they get time in front of a computer. So what does that feel like with a student? Well, to the student, I suspect that sometimes all these learning experiences can feel disconnected. Not because the curricula is different in the different materials, but because the student isn't always getting clear information on their progress. They want to know, stop and think about it. What do they want to know? They want to know how much they need to learn to pass the GED or HiSET or TASC or get into a career program. So I'm not criticizing the way teachers teach. It's not about that. But rather, I'm looking at what that reality must feel like to the student who's trying to use all these different materials and resources to get where they want to go. So what I'm saying is the task of integrating all these different learning resources and giving learners real-time feedback on their progress towards their goal is a big job. I'd like to suggest a different way of thinking about this. Now, don't get nervous. It's not going to replace any teachers or make more work for anybody. You got to understand, I'm kind of a technology geek, so I think about this way. What I'm suggesting is that we look at how digital learning technology can be used differently. Instead of thinking about learning software as an add-on or supplement to the instruction, I'm suggesting we think about it as a guided pathway, which connects all the learning for the student. Okay, so this is not my idea. Okay, I got it from somebody else. It comes from a really fascinating book called Redesigning America's Community College by Thomas Bailey, Shauna Smith-Jaggers, and Davis Jenkins. Really recommend the book. It's very interesting. So what is a guided pathway model? It simply means that there is a core pathway that the learner follows, and that all the learning experiences they encounter, the books, the software, lectures, one-on-one tutoring, are all connected to each other. Okay, that kind of makes sense, but the question is, like, how does that happen? We're talking about a major job of integrating a whole range of teaching materials. So you're probably ahead of me here and suspect that the solution can come, yes, from advanced learning technology, which has the ability to connect all these learning experiences for the student. And the key piece of that is to give them real-time feedback on their progress. So let's go into this a little bit. What needs to happen to make this be, or what does the software need to do? Well, there's 4 things. First, for the software to provide that kind of integration, it needs to provide, or it needs to be a complete curriculum. In other words, it needs to cover everything that the student needs. It needs to be aligned with CCR standards and all the other assessments. It needs to provide deep instruction as well as practice. And this is one of the core recommendations, as we'll see from the Joyce study. And third, it needs to be able to create that optimal learning path for the student based on what they need to know and what they already know, and as well as to build on the foundational skills. In other words, it needs to be smart learning software. And fourth, it needs to give the teacher some easy-to-use diagnostics. Okay, so what I'm saying is that the digital learning technology software is kind of a river that connects everything. Now, this can sound like extra work for the teacher, but actually the amazing thing about adaptive learning software, it already does all of these things for the learner and the teacher. It's happening automatically. And the teacher doesn't need to do anything. Okay, so let's look, say, just a little bit more into this at some of the ways that the reports that the teacher can get data. This is a report from a type of program, shows the readiness of each student. It's looking at the practice test scores. In this case, I think this is an alignment to the TABE test. Here's another, it's kind of probably hard for you to see, but it's a dashboard. So at one glance, the teacher can get a summary of the students who are actually ready for the GED test. Students who are almost ready, students who need more study. They can see a range of the practice test scores. They can look at how many students have been logging in and when. And they can actually see who's passed the test. Okay. Right, I want to go into the study a little bit more, the findings, but I wanted to stop again to see if there are any questions that I should answer.
Nope, you can keep chugging right along.
Okay, All right. Another element of the study, or recommendations of the study for effective learning technology, is that it contains progress indicators. So at its core, education is a transaction between the learner and the material they are learning. They invest their time to accomplish a goal, and they want to know how they're doing. Trying to learn something without constant feedback is frustrating and often not effective. We talked about this earlier. So what kind of information would facilitate this? Here's an example of a type of report that's used in an adaptive learning program that can do this. It's a dashboard for the student. So they can see as they move through levels. It's built on 3 levels, like video games are. It's a leveling process. They can see scores on assessments that they're doing. The students in this case are making a commitment when they start the program of the time they're going to study each week, and then they see how much time they spend each day according to that goal. Over here shows them what they are mastering through these 3 levels. And these are the units they are studying, and they can see their progress on those. And then this shows them, it's kind of like, I think it could be a dialogue box. It's actually a dialogue with the students. Okay. All right, the next thing, let's get on to the next recommendation. The next thing the study suggested, Joyce study suggested, is that a digital program should be built on mastery learning principles. Okay, so what is mastery learning and what are these principles? Mastery learning, implementing mastery learning into the classroom could be a whole different webinar. In fact, we've created a webinar for it, and you go to those links that are provided. You can listen to it if you want to understand more, or give Dan and I, send us an email. We'll go into that with it. But just briefly, it came out of the work of Benjamin Bloom, the guy who invented Bloom's taxonomy. His work with mastery learning, which spanned over 3 decades and hundreds of trials. So basically what they did is they created learning experiences or experiments that compared 3 things. The red is a regular classroom. The blue was a trial where the students were only getting one-on-one tutoring. And the green was where they combined the features of personal tutoring with the classroom. And what they found was that 84% of the students were successful. That means that 84% of the students were getting B work or better. In its simplest form, what is happening here is that mastery learning is a cycle of assessment, teaching, assessment, reteaching, over and over again till the student has demonstrated mastery in the particular material. Again, I'm just going through that briefly, and we can go into that later, or if you want, if there's time at the end. Okay, so we've talked about, the big 3 things here. Here are some more things that were suggested by the study. One is, of course, that the learning content be relevant to adults. This obviously helps the students stay motivated and keep coming back. It's got to be important to their lives. And of course, this corresponds or coordinates with the WIO recommendations, where we contextualize the learning as much as possible, trying to make it real. A second recommendation was to divide the lessons into short modules to stay within the attention span. And this can tap in terms of technology, this can tap into a type of learning called spaced learning. And again, you can search for it. It's pretty interesting. Spaced learning techniques divide learning into really small bites, usually about 15 to 20 minutes. So the student studies for about 20 minutes. then they get a break in their thinking. So they're doing something else, maybe playing a game or something. Now they go back to the material. Very interesting thing happens is because when they go back, their brains are kind of tuned to be more attentive to the material than when they were involved previously. Okay, another recommendation is that the content be aligned to standards or competency exams. Another recommendation is that it reduce the reading load by scaffolding with audio and video. And finally, that the digital tools, to make the digital tools flexible so that they fit into the way adult ed teachers are actually teaching. Okay, so.
Michael?
Yeah.
Can I interrupt you for a question that would be well suited right here?
Yep, please. Thank you.
There's a question about, trying to picture this actually happening in the classroom with the students all working in kind of individualized learning plans. How does the teacher coordinate that? I think there might be some things in our blended learning guide that could be mentioned, but some of the different models for that classroom integration and best practices you might want to touch on.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to go into some more things in just a minute that I think might answer that.
Okay.
And if I haven't, then let's, if that questioner could re-ask the question or maybe ask, whatever, we can get back to that. Because I think it's a fairly big thing, a big question. So what I'd like to do now is kind of bring this all together into kind of what that question was about, and really talk about how we can integrate all of this into our classrooms. And I want to do this by kind of looking at the problems we encounter as teachers every day. Okay, so the reality things like students dropping out or stopping out. Students who struggle keeping up, students who have gaps in their foundation skills, students who don't read or comprehend well, and who struggle with technology. And then on the teacher side, how, which I think is what that question was, how do they do this? How do they have time to look at reports, figure out how to integrate instruction with software instruction? And of course, then there's always the frustration of restricted budgets. So what I'd like to do is kind of go into these things, these questions, and then maybe we could have a little discussion about it. And I'll kind of offer some suggestions about how I see software helping with these things, but then maybe we could discuss it as well, get some feedback from the attendees. First of all, I just want to say learning technology cannot replace a good teacher. That's not what this study was about. But even a good teacher needs help, especially with adult learners, because this is a challenging group to teach to. So how can software solve some of these problems? For example, how can it help with attrition, students dropping out? Excuse me. I think as I look at this problem, I think one of the things that can really help with this is the feedback indicators. That was what the terminology that the Joyce study recommended. And basically what it's saying is helping the students to see the results of what they are doing, how those results contribute to their goal, okay? Connecting to what they're doing to their goal, okay? Another thing that comes to mind is how advanced learning technology can accelerate learning. This can happen, and I see it happening, because the learning path is more clearly defined for the student. In other words, they're studying only the things they need to learn. it's not like trying to impose a one-size-fits-all curriculum on a student. And I think also this is where mobile learning can really help with those students who stop coming to class because of transportation issues or childcare issues. Making the learning available to them on their cell phones can really help. And I think also, okay, I already said that. All right, let's go to the next thing about, well, are there any questions or suggestions? I'm trying to make this a dialogue, but I'm not sure it will work. Okay, let me keep going here. What about the question of students who are struggling to keep up, who have gaps in their knowledge? How can advanced learning technology help these students? Again, I'm kind of a broken record here, but this is where adaptive learning and flexibility with the way technology teaches can really help. Why? Because software can pinpoint exactly what the student needs to know, and it can have a built-in mechanism that reteaches material that the student is having trouble with. So, not only can the student go back and repeat that lesson, but a good adaptive software program can, through a progress of assessments, determine that a student still didn't, even though they were presented and taught a particular skill, they still haven't mastered that. And so that then they can reteach that skill and make sure the student gets that before they go on. That's what the software can provide for the teacher. We've talked about number 4, students not being strong readers, and about how more audio and video, using that to teach, can really help. Now, okay, what about students who lack technology skills? It seems to me that it needs to be a core responsibility of the software designers. Not only do they need to design software that teaches better, but they should be designing learning software that's really easy to use, that requires no prior knowledge about how learning software works, except how to log in and click on things. And we've talked a little bit about how teachers can use digital technology to integrate with their direct instruction. And we've looked at some samples of reports. The reality is, though, many teachers don't have time to look at reports or adjust their curriculum to the data about their students. It seems to me the answer to this is better software. Software that can do more for the teacher, not require more of the teacher. Again, this is where digital software, learning software that's built on sophisticated learning algorithms can really help the teacher. It's giving them a tremendous amount of information about their students and about their whole class. And it can sound like integrating all of this can be more work, but in actuality, smart software does all of this for the teacher. It's the concept I talked about earlier of the digital platform taking on the core role of a guided pathway as being the center of the learning, not as an addition. Okay, let me just throw one question out to you, because I just want to swing back to kind of summarize what the findings were in the Joyce study. And that's the question is, how does your program make decisions about how they spend technology dollars or budgets? Are these decisions based on what they've used in the past? Are they based on relationships with software providers? Are they based on learning outcomes or results? I think that's the whole point of why the Joyce Foundation funded this study, was to suggest a different kind of evaluation, a different way to make a decision about software and so that people can benefit from the support it can give. So basically, this would be a checklist that you could use in your decision process based on the findings of the Joyce study. Does it include adaptive learning? Does it include progress feedback, mastery learning? Is the content relevant to adults? Can the lessons be taken in short sessions, in chunks? Is it aligned with the CCR standards? Does it have a minimum reading load in terms of teaching? And is it flexible to meet the needs? Okay, I'd like to stop here and answer some questions. We have about 7-8 minutes left, and maybe we can answer some questions. Dan?
One question that was asked that I think is worth talking to here right away would be, what do you think the non-online portion of a blended classroom might look like in a classroom where students are using the Essential Ed or a similar program? So, maybe can you paint a little picture of what that looks like for folks?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I've seen teachers do is break the class into small groups and physically, change the structure of the classroom. So that, with a quick look at some reports on the skills that the students are mastering, you can quickly see that and group the students into areas that they need work. So, it's a math classroom, and it's clear that there's a group of 3 or 4 students who really need some work on foundational skills. They're struggling with fractions, or whatever. And so instead of trying to teach to a whole group, break it into small groups. That really works. The other thing I've seen is where teachers use the software as simply a series of one-on-one sessions with a student. Adaptive learning software can create reports that the teacher can use to work with the students and it can help in a couple of ways. One is it's giving that student feedback. It's letting them know, look, this is where you are. This is what you've accomplished. Good job. Here's high fives, pat on the back. Here's what you need to work on next. So they are really getting the support they need. And then that session can also focus on a particular thing that particular student needs. Is that helpful?
Yeah, great. You might want to open up the Q&A button if you have it. If you can, do you see it in your toolbar there, Michael? Because there are 4 or 5 questions on there that you could just answer directly from the post.
Okay, one question was, is there any free OER adaptive software available, specifically to ESOL? No, I've not seen it. Some of the content in Khan Academy is adaptive. The challenge using Khan material is that it's not aligned to anything in adult ed. It's not aligned to the GED or HiSET or task tests. So it becomes a lot of work for the teacher to figure out what they need to pull out and focus on. So again, sorry, I don't know of anything that's free. Do you have any suggestions for integrating digital, using digital? Do you have any suggestions on supporting teachers in using and integrating digital platforms? I think I've already said a lot about that. If I haven't, maybe you could contact me after. I joined late. Was the research based on students using software programs that were all in one package, or did it include also classes built by instructors in LMS. No, it was using software programs that were already built.
Michael, in our blended learning guide that we've published, is that on your resources page that
Yes.
people will be getting?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So you might just want to talk a little bit about that, because there's a lot of great suggestions in there for helping people figure out how to actually implement from theory to actual classroom application.
Yeah, last year we asked David Rosen and Carmen Stewart to write a guide on blended learning. It's about 100 pages, 125 pages long, and we just funded it. David's used it in many workshops. You may have been exposed to it. I've included a link to that. You can download it as a PDF, and it goes into very specific recommendations on how to do the things that we've talked about. Not just using software that's from a publisher, but other tools as well, other digital tools as well. Google Docs, for example, and many other things.
And then we also have, just to mention to everybody, a terrific professional development course we created called Blended Learning in Adult Education, and you can find information about that on our website as well, if you're looking for additional resources on building.
I think I answered that question already. Isn't there a connection between essential ed reports and the standards in the GED testing service? Yes, there is. Yes, you will get a copy of the PowerPoint after this. And Sharon, I need to give you an updated version of the PowerPoint, because I changed it from what I did before. I added a couple slides. If a student takes a practice test in GED testing service, refers to what study, that's specific to that. Okay, let me just say a couple final words. One thing is that David Rosen, again mentioning him, he's okay. So let me just say this. Okay, so how do we actually, or how does one actually implement these findings? Is it just to buy different digital learning software? Sure, that'll help, but I don't think that's the whole solution. I think there are other things that need to be done. And really the question is, what do you need to make change? And I don't think it's about funding. It's basically how to get more results with less. So one of the things, the ways to, perhaps to get into this problem is to talk about it. David Rosen has created a Google group about blended learning to talk about this. I've included a resource, sent him an email and asked to be in that group. It's very interesting, a lot of interesting discussions. I should note, David's out of the country till the end of the month, so if he doesn't get back to you, don't worry about it. And the last thing I'd like to say is I'd like to send out a call to action to the publishers. I don't know if there are any other publishers that are on this webinar or not, but really the Joyce Foundation has made very clear recommendations for features that will produce better results. And I think it's time for publishers to make that investment because adult ed needs all the help it can get. So thank you for your time. Sharon, you want to take over? Anything?
Thank you so much, Michael. And we're here at 3 o'clock, so I just would like to thank everybody for making time for this important webinar. And a special thanks to Michael Ormsby. Michael and Essential Education have been an excellent partner to COABE and to the field in general. So we just thank you for your support and for exhibiting at the COABE conference and for sponsoring wonderful webinars like this. Thank you, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you at the National Conference on March 25th through the 28th in Phoenix, Arizona. And Michael, do you want to say anything before we say goodbye?
No, I put the resources at the end. Oh, no, I didn't. Here they are at the end. And please, if you have any questions about anything, just feel free to contact me or Dan. Happy to help. Thank you for your.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye.
Bye now.